Hi there, everyone. This is Dr. Sardo, and I've put together this short video to help you tackle reading assignments in advanced and honors, history, and social science classes. My goal is to give you some kind of explanation on how reading assignments work and how to best approach them so that you can both complete them efficiently, but more importantly, actually read for understanding, because that really is the emphasis and the point of reading assignments at this level. It's not simply to read to get it done, but to read to really understand. So before we get into how to read for understanding, it's important to think a little bit about why we assign reading in these classes. Why do we assign reading in humanities, social science, English, history classes? Well, we're trying to do a few things. The first is reading is the first exposure to some content material, right? You might learn something. You might learn something about some historical person or event. You might learn about some social scientific theory or explanation or relationship, right? Part of what you're doing with reading prior to class is getting a first round exposure to certain material so that when you come to class, you are prepared to discuss, ask questions, dig deeper, right? You are actually learning content, gaining knowledge while reading. The second is that assigning reading, practicing reading helps you develop skills, helps you develop analytical skills, helps you develop reading skills, and it actually helps you develop writing skills by being exposed to more prose. The act of reading should be thought of kind of like a problem set in a math or science class. What you're doing is you're actually practicing the techniques of historical analysis, causal reasoning, contextualization, all the skills that we practice in class. You are getting an opportunity to practice that at home. So you should think of reading as homework, as work. Treat it like work. Reading isn't just like, oh, I can have my textbook open and skim through the pages while I'm binging Netflix. You should set aside time and in a place to do your reading. You should turn off your cell phone, put it in a different room, disconnect from the internet, right? You should treat reading as work. That is what your sole focus should be on. And if you don't do that, you're not going to be effective. So you might be thinking to yourself, how am I going to read all these complex sources, these long entries in the textbook, all these scholarly sources? And so I want to break down three different types of reading assignments: textbook reading assignments, which are probably going to be the bulk of most of your reading; historical sources, which will be both in class and out of class; and the occasional scholarly sources. Because each of these sources, each of these types of readings, is going to function differently because they exist for different purposes, right? And so how you approach reading each of these sources is going to be different. So let's first start with the textbook. All right, a textbook is a really unique source, right? It is not a primary source, it's not a historical source, and it's not really a secondary source, right? A textbook is written by a scholar who has synthesized a bunch of information from primary and secondary sources and their experience, and they provide a overarching narrative or overview on the material, right? The textbook isn't a work of scholarship, it is a synthesis of a work of scholarship. It isn't a primary source, it isn't a secondary source. It is giving you an overview. Like a textbook doesn't read like other books, right? It doesn't read like other books. It's not trying to give you a narrative. It's not trying to make an argument, right? It is trying to provide an overview of information. That being said, textbooks can be daunting. You might get your history textbook and see 1,000 pages. How are you going to get through all of that in a school year? So here's my tips. The first is read backwards. Now, I don't mean read every word backwards. I mean start with the end in mind. What are you supposed to accomplish with this assigned reading? What are you supposed to learn or know? And so, the best way to do this is to look at the resources that I've given you or they're in the textbook. Look at the end of the chapter in the textbook. There might be review questions. Start by reading those review questions first to figure out what the big ideas of that assigned reading are going to be. I will always give you learning objectives, whether on a unit overview or in the slides from the previous class, of what I want you to take away from that class. Use those learning objectives first. Read those first so that you know what the goal I have in mind for you is. Your textbook might have something called focus questions at the beginning of the chapter, right? Use these to identify what the main ideas, what the goal, what the purpose of the reading is. Start with the end in mind, right? Keep that goal in mind as you read. Does this information that I just read help me answer this focus question? Does it help me actually achieve a learning objective? Then I probably don't need to focus on that trivial detail, right? Reading with the end in mind, focusing on the objective is going to help you both read more efficiently, you're going to get through the reading faster, and more effectively. You're going to have a better understanding of the material afterwards. Use the book's scholarly apparatus, right? Textbooks are written to help you. They are written to guide your reading, right? Look at headings. They're usually in bold, a different color, right? For example, the transformation of law. These are going to give you main ideas. Guiding questions might appear on the header, right? What were the main elements of the market revolution? Reading checks can help your understanding. There might be little summary questions or analysis questions on the side of the text in the textbook that are going to help you understand, to check your understanding. Call-out boxes might draw attention to important information, whether they're definitions of key terms, whether they're indicating important documents or Supreme Court cases or concepts that we're going to come back to, right? Don't just blow through these things. Whether it's images, primary sources, data tables, charts, call-out boxes, headers, subheaders, right? These are all designed to provide a scaffolding for you to help you read better. Don't just ignore them and move on. Now, when you're taking notes, you want to take smarter notes, not more notes. So in general, I think you should experiment in different styles that work for you, but obviously if your teacher requires you to take notes in a particular format, you should listen to them. Maybe you think that gist notes are the best, where you kind of jot down bullet point summaries for key ideas or headings. Maybe you really like Cornell notes, where you have 2 columns. You have questions, key terms, and ideas on the left, where you have important information on the right, with summary at the bottom. Maybe you prefer a mind map, where you are kind of mapping out how concepts relate to each other. Experiment with styles that work for you. Remember, the point of notes is for twofold. First, it's to help you actively engage with the reading so that you have a better understanding of the reading while you're doing it. And second, it's to provide a record of what you've learned so that you can go back to study. I generally don't think it's a good idea to just try to summarize every single paragraph, every single sentence of the textbook. Instead, you should organize your notes from learning objectives or focus questions, and then try to use after you read sections, after you read a whole chapter, go back and jot down information that helps you meet those objectives or answer those questions. In general, you want to use bullet points, symbols, and abbreviations. You don't want to transcribe. You don't want to just take the information from one piece of paper to another piece of paper without it passing through your brain, right? The act of actually trying to summarize, to abbreviate, to use symbols and bullet points forces your mind to actually engage with the material, to synthesize, to summarize, to simplify, and in doing so, you're going to actually understand it better. Finally, keep it organized and write neatly, right? There's no point of doing the notes if you're so unorganized and so messy that you can't come back and use them to study. Now, while you're reading, you might encounter an unfamiliar word or concept, and there's a temptation to just move on, but at the very least, you should mark it. Highlighter, pen, multiple colors of pens to mark different things, right? And this is part of actively reading and taking notes. If it's just a simple word that you don't know the meaning to, God invented on the 8th day a dictionary so that you can look up words. If you can't understand a concept or an example, circle it, write a question mark next to it, write down the question so that you can ask it in class, right? That is part of doing your reading homework. Keep a running list of confusing words or advanced concepts that you're having trouble with so that you can learn and grow in that way. Now we're turning to historical sources. Now the historical sources are a little bit trickier because these are not written with the student in mind. These are not written to provide an overview for a student. These were written in particular contexts by particular people with particular intentions for a particular audience, right? These are not written to describe what's happening most of the time at a historical event. They're usually trying to say, help, I need money, or I think you should come and visit me, right? Historical sources are not like scholarly sources. They're not like your textbook. My first piece of advice: be a skeptical reader. Don't just accept the source at face value. Think about why the author is writing what they are writing. Think about why they are presenting information in this way. What are the rhetorical techniques that they are using, right? You want to dig deeper to find out what is hiding beneath this surface. Think of yourself as a detective trying to figure out what, the who, what, where, when, why, and how. Think of yourself like a lawyer interrogating a hostile witness on the stand. Now, we're going to introduce now a acronym, HIPP, that you're going to be tired of hearing, but this is a way that you can frame your analysis of a primary source. First, think about the historical context. What was happening before, during, or after the source was published, right? What is going on in the world in the specific location in that time period? What are the overarching historical developments or trends that shaped this source, right? Historical sources don't come out of nowhere. They're written in a particular time and place. What was going on in that time and place that is shaping the source? What was the specific occasion of this document? Was it reacting to a new law, the coronation, a revolution, right? But also think, is this document being published in a newspaper? Is it a private diary? Was it meant for a single person, a public audience? Is this a speech? Is this a letter, right? What was the specific context, not just general context, but the specific occasion of the source being produced? You can also think, if you're trying to think even more critically, about how is it that this source came into our hands? But that's a question for another time. The next, you should think about who the audience was for the source. To whom was this source directed to and why, right? How does the audience's values or ideals affect the types of language and rhetoric, metaphors, symbols, ideas that are in the source? You can't interpret a source correctly if you don't understand who the author was writing to. Next, think about the point of view. Who created this source? What was their class, occupation, religion, nationality, political affiliation, education, gender? And how does the background of that author shape the source? You shouldn't treat these sources as simply existing outside of a creator, but the creator of the source matters, right? It matters who made this source. That can shape the language they use, the metaphors they use, the different religious appeals that they make. And finally, what is this source trying to do? What was the purpose? What was the intended effect the source was trying to do? Now, it's important to remember that sources were not simply there to describe historical events. When people live through historical events, they don't really think about, I need to record this for posterity. Though sometimes that is the case if it's a historical chronicle or something like that. But they're trying to warn about an impending war, borrow money, try to get reelected, try to impeach a president, right? Think about what the source was trying to do. What effect in the world was it intended to have? And remember, the purpose is not always, and often is not, the main idea of the source. Now, when we get to scholarly sources, we're approaching something really entirely differently. A textbook is written for a student, historical sources are written in a particular time and place, but scholarly sources are actually written for other scholars. They're not written for you. They're engaging in an academic debate about explaining some phenomenon or interpreting some evidence, right? And so the first and most important lesson is this. Scholarly sources are hard because they weren't written for you. They were written for other scholars with PhDs. They were written based on based on the assumption that you know a lot about the subject area and the advanced methodological techniques, whether it's statistics or hermeneutic analysis, right? You can't just simply waltz into a scholarly source. That being said, here are some tips. First, and always with scholarly sources, don't get lost in the details, but focus on the big picture. What is the author's research question? What is the puzzle or problem that they are responding to? What is the author's argument? What is their kind of main idea, their main thesis? Identifying that is the most important takeaway. Thirdly, what evidence do they use to defend this argument? Now, you might not be able to interpret every single data table or OLS regression or philological analysis or literary analysis, but you should be able to identify they use polling data from the 1920 general election, or they are analyzing these works of literature, or they're trying to study the reception of different political cartoons, right? At least being able to identify and describe that evidence is really important. And finally, what broader conclusions do they draw? Why does this argument matter? How does that shape the way we understand the topic in question, right? So this means when you're reading a scholarly source, you might not need to read every single point. Read the introduction to figure out what the puzzle and the main argument is. Skim over the data in the evidence section to get the main kind of what evidence they're drawing, but read closer on the discussion or the analysis sections and definitely the conclusions so that you can get the main idea of that source. Now, you want to still do some evaluation of these scholarly sources. You want to think about, is the argument and evidence persuasive, right? Does it pass the smell test? Is it at least a plausible account of what's going on? Are there alternative explanations or counter-arguments or counter-examples that need to be considered? And then how generalizable is the theory that the author presents? Does the argument only hold in a specific case, or does it hold more broadly to describe human phenomena, right? You want to kind of still try to interrogate these sources, even though the author might be more qualified than you, right? You can find holes. You can evaluate the strengths and limitations of these arguments just as well as anyone else. I want to close with some words of advice from a philosophical hero of mine, Friedrich Nietzsche. And here he's talking about philology, which is really the art of studying words and how words change and their historical meanings and development. But I think this advice holds, right? He says that philology is the venerable art which exacts from all its followers one thing above all: to step to one side, to leave themselves spare moments, to grow silent, to become slow. The leisurely art of the goldsmith applied to language. An art which must carry out slow, fine work and attains nothing if not lento. For this very reason, philology is now more desirable than ever before. For this very reason, it is the highest attraction and incitement in an age of work, that is to say, of haste, of unseemly and immoderate hurry, which is intent on getting things done at once, even every book, whether old or new. Philology itself perhaps will not get things done so hurriedly. It teaches how to read well, i.e., slowly, profoundly, attentively, prudently, with inner thoughts and mental doors ajar, with delicate fingers and eyes. I think you should try to apply this same art of reading slowly, deliberately, attentively, profoundly, and prudently, right? In our age, with all of your AP classes, extracurricular commitments, sports teams, TikTok trends, dates, social events, right? There's an attempt to just get the reading done as quickly as possible. And I understand that and totally sympathize with that. But you're going to get more out of the reading. You're going to have to study less. You're going to perform better in class discussions and in your essays by really engaging in this slow, fine work. To leave yourself that spare moment to you so that you can approach things not with the immoderate hurry-scurry of getting things done, but with the slow, profound attention of a scholar. And my final piece of advice: reading is hard work. Like any other skill, it requires practice, patience, and persistence. The only way to get better at reading is to read more, is to push yourself to read more difficult things, is to read in your free time, to read all kinds of books, whether it's literature or comic books, whether it's a romance novel or a scholarly treatise. The more you read, the more you practice that skill and those muscles, the better reader, and the better thinker, the better writer, the better scholar you'll become. That's all the advice I have for you. Good luck this year.